So we're going to talk about, of course, it's me, I'm the process guy, so we're going to talk about process management, but I want to talk about a very important use case for process management and our process architectures and other artifacts. That's just managing compliance and risk. Sometimes people don't think about it like this, but I think it's fundamentally important way we can do that. So, but before we do that, just a couple of slides, 3 slides in fact, just to slight expansion on what Dan was just saying about 3 concepts that I use to encapsulate my view of what process-based management is like. We'll talk about the circles, we'll talk about primacy of process, and we'll talk about how we enable those circles to turn. So just get through that briefly so at least we all have a shared understanding of where I come from. But the most important thing to talk about is why we would do process-based management at all. It's the purpose of all the process work we do. And I think it's fundamental, and sometimes we don't pay it enough attention, particularly we process people who get very fascinated by our models and our diagrams and our PowerPoint presentations where it always works. But what is the purpose of all of this? And I think of it like this. The only objective for all of the work we do in process, I summarize it as PVBB, and by that I mean proven, valued, business benefits. So these are benefits, they've got to be benefits, and they're benefits to the business, not just to the process team, and valued by the business. You know, if we process practitioners are the only ones who think our process models are really useful, then we've lost something. And of course, they've got to be proven, the benefits got to be proven with hard data beyond any objections. Proven, valued business benefits. I think that's a phrase or an acronym that we should have up before us all the time and be reminding ourselves, are we delivering on that promise? Because that's the promise we make in all of our process work. By the way, on that screen, you'll see over on the left-hand side there's a little icon of a kind of camera. If you see the PDF of any of my slides, you click on that and it'll take you to a related YouTube video on my YouTube channel that will be something about the topic on the screen. So whenever you see a PDF and you got one of those, it's clickable. Okay, so let's get on. So this is my process-based management on a slide. I call this the primacy of process. It's the number one principle, why we do any of this kind of work and why it's important and why it works, etc. So the primacy of process says 2 things. It says we've got 2 perspectives of an organization. We've got the traditional functional organization, or the vertical perspective, if you like, and that's traditional management. But we also know that we've got a horizontal or process perspective, which is to say we get work done in our organizations across the organization chart. We don't get it done up and down, but traditionally we manage up and down, but we get stuff done across. So there's a disconnect there, which is the whole point of our process-based management operations. So in that vertical direction, it's largely about managing resources and related decisions. And the key artifact there, of course, is the process architecture. In the horizontal direction, which is where we create, accumulate, and deliver value to our customers and other stakeholders, which, by the way, is the same as saying that's how we execute our strategy. That's an important point. In that horizontal view, the key artifact is going to be process architecture. So everything we do in the process perspective, the horizontal view, is about how we're getting work done. But in the vertical direction, it's really how we're organizing the functional units. It's about managing the organization chart as opposed to managing cross-functional processes. And we know we've got to have both. We're not changing the organization chart. Nothing we do in the process management space must necessarily make a change to the org chart. That's not what it's about. It's an overlay. These are 2 different perspectives of the same organization about who's doing the work and what the work is that we're doing. So importantly, why we would even do process-based management is because it's managing the way in which we execute our strategy, which is the way in which we create, accumulate, and deliver value to our customers. It's the real business of the organization. Now, the way I think about us doing that is the Tregear circles. And we're talking here about a particular process, any process, big or small. And there are two things here. We're going to think about the PO, or process ownership circle, or you might think about that as process management if you prefer, or the PI circle, or process improvement circle. So one in which we're doing managing of the process, we're making ownership decisions, governance decisions, and the other ones we're actually getting on and doing something about the process. So how does it work? This is, and we create here, I think it's a kind of meta model for management generally, and it's kind of a perpetual improvement engine. Not quite as perpetual as we'd like, but it gives us the capability of doing that. Let's start with the PO circle. You can see there that it's got 3 nodes: target, assess, respond. Target, assess, respond. I think this is the drumbeat of process management. Target, assess, respond. Target, assess, respond. Target is about saying, okay, for this particular process that we're looking at, how should it perform? You know, what are the process KPIs and their targets? And that's an important piece to do. And so many people miss that or don't put enough effort into it because, you know, if we don't have a target, then we don't know whether it's performing well enough. We're not measuring it against targets. We don't know if it's improving, etc. So, you know, what are the process KPIs? I've written extensively in lots of videos, lots of recordings on process performance. Don't get me started here, we'll run out of time. So we've set the targets, and then we're going to assess is the next node. 2 things we're going to do at assess. We're going to assess against performance against those targets. So the target's 9 out of 10 and we're getting 9.5, or we're getting 8 out of 10. So we're actually collecting the data and analysing actual performance. But the other thing we do at assess is to assess other ideas, innovations for change. You know, we're on target, everything seems to be going well, but here's an idea, some new technology, new approach, new way of executing our process that we need to check out, the classic innovation piece. And we want to embed that in our process thinking. It's not separate. It needs to be embedded. So 2 things we'll do there. We'll assess whether we've got problems or opportunities that we need to do something about. And respond, of course. If we don't respond, there was no point in doing anything else. So at respond, we might do 3 things. We might do nothing because everything's on target, everything's going well, trending well, no new ideas to test, and the process KPIs are, we don't need to review those. So do nothing might be the more common response. The other thing we might do is say, okay, well, it's been a while, or something's changed, we need to review the process KPIs and or their targets. And we should do that regularly, depending on the process, but maybe you're going to do it every 6 months, certainly every 12 months, or if you know the environment's changed, or you've been improving the process, maybe the targets need to change now as well. So you might be then going to say, okay, let's review those targets. The other thing that you might need to do, though, is that you've discovered a problem, an actual current problem or an emerging problem, and we would like to discover emerging problems, wouldn't we, so they don't actually realise, or we've got an opportunity to test. Now, that's going to trigger a turn of the PI circle. And the PI circle is pretty much anybody's process improvement methodology. As is, the current state, to be, the future state, and to do is just my summary of all the things we've got to do to create a new as is. And by the way, worth reminding ourselves that the purpose of process improvement projects is not to create a to be, but to create a new as is. We need to actually make the changes. Now, sometimes, you know, the process improvement piece of work, maybe there are several projects that get triggered by that process improvement project, and sometimes they'll take a few days, but they might take months, depending on the nature of the change. But in the meantime, the PO circle keeps turning. So we're always measuring performance. And in saying we're going to make a change, a process improvement change, we'll change this and the performance will improve. We'll be testing for that as we do the analysis back in the PO circle. So the PO circle is always turning, particularly for those high impact processes that we want to manage actively. And then we'll have a turn, we'll run a process improvement project whenever we feel the need to do so, whenever the respond node says we should do so. So we're always here. I talk all the time about getting the circles turning, and these are the circles I mean. So we pick the high impact processes, the ones that we want to actively manage, which is not thousands, it might be tens, it probably isn't even hundreds, but which processes we need to actively manage. We've got the PO circle turning for those. PO circle analysis is going to trigger process improvement projects. If we've got a real or emerging problem or an opportunity, we've got to assess. We'll get in, we'll do that, we'll make the change. The PO circle will tell us whether we were successful or not. And if we weren't successful, then we can have us think about why that, what changed, what else changed, or why we weren't as successful as we meant to. So we've got the primacy of process view of life, vertical and horizontal. Here are the circles. We're actively investigating high impact process performance. But how do we get the circles to turn? These are what I call the 7 enablers of BPM. My Reimagining Management book is pretty much about this in its entirety. Each of these 7 enablers has a chapter. So this is going to be the one bullet point version of each of these. But firstly, let's say that we've got 7 enablers and you need them all. I developed this like 30 years ago because I was helping organizations have a look at their process operations and saying, it's not quite working, what's wrong? And it turned out that these are the 7 things you need. And if it's not quite working, then at least one of these isn't working well enough with the others. So we need them all. They're all equally important. If you're working on one, you're going to have an impact on at least a couple of others, which is a good thing. And if you're working on 2 or 3 of them, you're probably impacting on all of them. We want to develop our capability across all those 7 enablers more or less in sync to give ourselves the best chance of establishing and sustaining good active process-based management. The order's not important, but we'll start with process architecture, because if we don't know what our processes are, then we're not going to be able to do much else. So we build process architecture. We just make those processes visible. We'll show an example of that in a moment. And then measurement. Okay, so that's all the things we said about measurement. How should it perform? How is it performing? How could it perform? How will it perform in the future? We can measure all of those kinds of things. And then governance is about, okay, we're going to mind the gap. What's the performance gap? Do we care? Do we care enough to do it now? What's the cost of changing it? The cost of not changing it? All of those sorts of things are going to be important. So this is the process governance piece, where we're actually making cross-functional process decisions about process performance and what we need to do about it, if anything. Now, change is in the middle of this list, but of course it's fundamental, because by this is proven valued business benefits. This is organizational change. I don't mean we've just changed some process model or we've improved the architecture. That's a tool. At the end of the day, we need to be delivering organizational performance benefits. And if we're not, then we are a process to be improved, if not discontinued. Mindset is so important. In fact, when this was first developed, these enablers, that was called process-aware culture, which is still perfectly good. It was just a bit long, but we need to be able to think process. If we're going to all do process in the same way, then we need to be able to think process. So what is it? What do we mean by process? How do we think about it? How do we all have a common understanding of why we have a process architecture, etc.? We have a common understanding of methodologies and those sorts of things. Capability is really, by here I just mean the English version of the meaning of that word, just the experience and expertise of everybody who needs to get involved at some level. And as I say, we don't want just 5 process analysts, we want 5,000, which is to say everybody has a role. Everybody out there right now in your organization is executing a variety of processes. The expertise in the execution is out there in the business. It's not in the process support group. They have their own particular expertise, of course, but everybody out there needs to do it. And that's expertise at various levels. Only a few people perhaps need to be able to create a process model, but lots of people need to be able to read one and interpret it and explain it and use it as a management tool. And that applies to all of those other elements, artifacts of our process work that we need to be able to control. And then last on the list, but certainly not least, is we do need some process support, that central group, the BPM support team or the operational excellence team or whatever it's called in your organization. These are the group of people internally, but I think their main role, is to raise capability across the rest of the organization. They are the experts. They are the people with ownership of the architectures. They are the process owner for the process of process management. So they're the people and they do quality assurance, all of those things. But they can't do everything. They're not magicians. They're only going to ever be in one place at any one time. So you don't want to build your ability to improve processes based on them always being in the room, because they become a bottleneck then. And we don't actually want to create a process improvement support team who is in fact themselves a bottleneck. That would be just embarrassing. So these are the 7 enablers, and they enable the circles to turn. So we need a plan for each of those, how we're going to improve architecture, measurement, governance, change, mindset, capability, and support. And it sounds like a lot, but it's not so hard to do. And once you get it going and start developing it, it just gets easier and easier as your process management maturity improves. So we've got primacy of process, why are we doing it anyway? And then we want to get this, for each process, we want to get the circles turning. And then to enable us to get those circles turning and keep them turning, we want to make sure that we've developed all of these enablers, because that will let us build and sustain process-based management. Okay, so what's all that got to do with compliance and risk management? Well, I think this is a classic and best use case for actually using process-based management. I'll go back to, this is ancient history for me. It might have been, I don't know, it's got to be 25 years ago, I think, when I did a project. It was for a university, and the university council or the board of the university asked the registrar, or if you prefer, the chief operating officer, but certainly called the registrar, they asked Pieter for a list of all of the things with which the university should comply. And this request had come from the risk and compliance subcommittee of the council. So, you know, it's a perfectly reasonable question, isn't it? What are all the things with which we should comply? Pieter, tell us, give us the list. You must have it. You're in charge. Well, both Pieter and the committee were a bit surprised at his answer, because they didn't have such a list. And whereas he could, you know, suggest a bunch of things with which they needed to comply, there was no coherent list. There was no sense of whether it was complete. Because there was no list, there was no way of comprehensively assigning ownership, understanding interrelationships, all of those sorts of things. So it was a bit of a blank slate. And that's a worry if you're, you know, the registrar, or you're indeed on the risk and compliance committee of council of a large multi-campus university with thousands of staff, tens of thousands of students. It's a big deal. It might be said that that's what the Risk and Compliance Committee is for, but we don't actually have a list of the things with which we should comply that's in any useful, practical sense. So Pieter, it turned out he didn't know it at the time, but he was a process thinker. And his general approach to this, to analyse the problem, good analysis of problem before we get to the solution, was, okay, all of the compliance requirements relate to the work we do. They must do. That's the whole point. We need to comply. Our work needs to comply with various things, and that's state government, federal government, occupational health and safety, internal guidelines, industry requirements. All of those kinds of things are real, but they all apply to the work that we do. So if we could describe the work that we do, as Pieter's thought, in some useful way, we could then match up compliance requirements with articles, elements of work. And that would give us the list and would give us some kind of way of managing them properly. So his question to lots of people, and ultimately to me, of course, was, can we do that? Well, you know, no surprise to any of us, yes, we can. And not only yes, we can, but yes, we did. So this is not quite as simple as going click, but this is the process architecture that was built for this university. As I say, 25, maybe closer to 30 years ago. I'm about to do another project for another university in a different country a couple of months. It will be interesting to see how what's changed in thinking along those times. But this is a view, process architecture is a view of the organisation, of everything it does, absolutely everything. On this one picture here, it's a high level view, of course, but at the top we've got those management processes, shared management processes. At the bottom, those supporting or enabling processes. And in the middle, the core processes where we're producing graduates, two sorts, undergraduates and postgraduates, and we're doing research, and we're engaging society and industry. So we built that process architecture. And by the way, I think every organisation should have one of these, and it's not as hard as most people think. This is something I do regularly, done it maybe 50 times. And, you know, in 3 weeks, we have 3-level architecture for almost any organisation. So I just say that to say it's not horrendously, it doesn't take years. It literally takes weeks before you've got a viable, useful management tool. So let's get back to the compliance though. Let's just take one of these, produce coursework graduate. That's a highest level core process. And it's got those sub-processes, which you'll recognise. But then we could let's take deliver learning experiences as a process, but we can do this for any process at any level. But we can now say, okay, what are all the compliance requirements that relate to this particular process? And and there are lots of them. There are internal policies, but this is a university, so there are national educational standards. There are financial requirements for relationships with governments, both national and state. We have duty of care, both to students and staff, so there's lots of compliance requirements there. For this university, was very keen on producing industry-ready students, graduates, and they had particular agreements with industry sectors about what they would do and not do, and how they would produce it and how they would relate to them. So these are all commitments that they've signed up to. Obviously, occupational health and safety across the university. This is multi-campus, as I say. Tens of thousands of students across the campuses, thousands of staff, building going on all the time, renovations, all sorts of stuff happening, all sorts of risk potential that should keep someone awake at night unless they're really on top of it. So, but now we can say, okay, let's collect all of that incrementally. We don't have to work it all out overnight, but incrementally we can add it here, and we can start saying, okay, what are the risks? How do we associate? We can model them. We're building a library of compliance requirements and ultimately related risks and risk assessments, if we like, and we're creating those, we're modeling that, we're adding that to our process models, we're connecting up all of those dots. We can connect compliance requirements together because they might have come out of two different standards, but they might have an impact, mutual impacts. And then we can start, now that we've got a handle on that, we can start to track it and we can assess risks. We can do all the usual compliance risks. We might build some kind of heat map that would effectively show in our process architecture where the, those classic high likelihood, high impact risks are, and then the low likelihood, massive impact risks, the red squares and the black squares. And then there are some things, as you know, if you're managing risk, sometimes what you do to manage it is say, okay, we can live with that because we can control it, or we'll set some flags so we know if it's going to happen. But if it happens, we can fix it, that kind of thing. So, but you can have a much more nuanced and detailed and comprehensive understanding of the processes that you're managing, which are the processes who need to comply with various standards and guidelines and policies, etc. And then you can apply risk management to that. So you've got a coherent picture now of risk management. So it's all about, as I say, get the circles turning. And use the circles and our understanding of deep understanding of our processes to do very good compliance management, because we know that every element of compliance is going to be directly related to one or more processes. Processes define everything we do. It's not possible to be doing something that's not related to a process. Risks events occur in our processes by definition. Every risk event is going to occur in a process. So we can look at the process and say, where is the risk? And the risk is likely to be some compliance non-conformance. And a process architecture gives us that framework, that structure in which we can embed all of these things and start having a very comprehensive and practical management tool. And the process architecture, as I say, is not hard to build. You can quickly get it in a matter of weeks. You can get it to a point where it's a useful management tool. And one of the things you can start doing is assigning all of your compliance requirements to that. So I want to leave you with this question. And this is the question really that Pieter was asked 30 years ago. And I wonder how many organisations have an answer to this question. What are all the things with which your organisation should comply? Does somebody have that list? If you were the Chief Operating Officer, do you have that list? If you're the chair of the Risk and Compliance Committee of the board, are you comfortable with the fact that you know or don't know, or how much you know about all the risks you need to do, the hundreds, if not thousands of things with which you should comply? I think this is the question. What are all the things with which our organisations should comply? It's a long list, and the consequences of being found to be non-compliant could be quite significant for individuals as well as for the organisation itself. The reputational damage itself might be incalculable. So that's the question that I want to leave you with, and we'll be back later to answer your questions, of course, but I'll hand over to Pieter, and he's going to show you how the interfacing platforms will help you to answer that question, or prepare to be able to answer that question when it is asked, because it will be asked. Over to you, Pieter. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Roger. Yeah, that's certainly very insightful, and I think a lot of people in the Australian market at this point in time can really relate with a lot of new rules, regulations, and standards that have been changing. So I think a lot of organizations are currently really grappling with that fact, in the sense of how do we comply if the legislation has changed, the regulatory impact on any business. So without further ado, let me quickly show my screen. One second. I think everybody should see that come through. So yeah, as the question that Roger has already asked, is a lot of organizations get really confronted with that question, in the sense of, okay, we've got all of these regulation and changes, but how do you prove it? And there's various different answers that, as per Roger in his previous section, really highlights that people think that in organizations they do, but realistically, if you don't really have a structured approach, then it is really hard to see how they are connected, and then how do you prove it? So for the stakeholders, the board, how do you really get to that point where you can demonstrate that you've got that capability? So from a compliance point of view, it's always hard, because content live in different registers. They are held in silos across different departments, and the perception always is process is for improvements. And again, going back to the circles, improvement is not just merely about doing things better, faster, or with less resources. It's also making sure, how do we execute our strategy, and making sure we execute the strategy without any impeding risks, or making sure that the rules that's been set by all the regulators and standards are being met. And there are certain metrics and KPIs, risk indicators, that also aligns with that. So it's really about, how do you take all of your information, your policies, your processes, your compliance, and make sure that you close that gap between operations live on one side of the spectrum, compliance and governance live on the other side of the spectrum, and making sure that they are all aligned in trying to achieve the right outcome, and demonstrating of how you can link all of those objects together. So really, process is not the delivery mechanism for compliance. Process is compliance. So clearly, as we mentioned, it demonstrates in what function of the area the business executes and how it executes in sequence. But more importantly, it also showcases handovers between different departments. Then we also know how it is governed. So if we've got clear ownership and metrics around what we're trying to measure and who is responsible and accountable there for those processes, is really what starts making the difference. And then when we start overlaying all the regulations, the risks, and the compliance requirements, that's really where the process starts to shine, because it's not just about improving how we operate from a speed perspective, but also how we really sort of tick the mark to say, can Peter ask the question if the board comes to him, what are all our requirements? Yes, here it is. Here's the list. We've linked it all out, and everything is connected. So what I thought was a really good example. So CPS 230, some of you may be aware of this legislation, but it is causing a lot of pain and heartache for a lot of financial institutions currently in the Australian market. And it needs to demonstrate that you understand all the compliance requirements, understand what are your critical operations, what are your tolerance, risk levels, and clearly indicate that you've got controls in place to show how you can demonstrate that you meet all of those obligatory requirements. So you've got all of your obligations, you've got your risks, your controls, roles and capability, you've got all these measurements to prove that you operate within certain tolerances, whether it's key performance indicators, key risk indicators, they're all part of that. And then you also need to make sure that you've got a business continuity management plan, and how that translates from your processes into how you execute all of your processes. So realistically, it's all about, how do we get to a point where we can identify, and this is a little bit copy paste. And by the way, Roger and I didn't really share notes, but it's really about, or slides, it's really about, how do you link all of those obligatory requirements to your processes, to your risks? What controls do you have embedded? What are the metrics? And how do you prove evidence-based results not only to the regulators, but to the board, to the executives, making sure that everybody can go to bed peacefully and knowing that the organization is running against the requirements that has been set. So really what I want to quickly show to you in our platform in the EPC, or the integrated management system, is how we can start getting all of these elements, showing that obligations and requirements are objects on their own. We can then start linking and create dependencies between all these different elements, from performance metrics, compliance, risk, all coming together, and essentially then give you a clear view to assess where are we hitting the mark, where are we in breach of the mark, and then turning into that next Tregear cycle is, how do we improve it? How do we go from where we are today to where we want to go? So again, changing that pure thinking of this is just an improvement initiative to it is an improvement initiative, but more from a compliance lens perspective. So I'm quickly now going to jump into the platform. Roger, if you can maybe just give me a note that you can see the platform, not the slides anymore.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So this is a landing page, just quickly highlighting it. We'll come back to this landing page. And this is going to be a very quick illustration. Obviously, if there's more questions, happy to take some offline and schedule more detailed analysis of what the tool can do. But on the left-hand side, you can see all the different modules. So we've got process, so that's where we build our process architecture. We've got documents, and most importantly, we've got the risk, control, and rules. So this is really where we start capturing all of these artifacts as individual objects, which means they are interchangeably and used as data points across the board, and not just limited to a line of text in a PDF that is stored on a SharePoint drive somewhere. So here we can see we've got all the different startup requirements. We've got 9001, 20 ISO standards, Australian standards. But if we go into CPS 230 and we open up the obligations register, we can see that we can have a list of all of the obligations that is bound from that specific regulatory requirement. If we then go into one of these obligations, we can clearly start saying, right, what does this obligation mean? What do we need to do? And then we can also start linking all of the responsibilities. Who are responsible or accountable? So here we can see that the Chief Operating Officer is accountable against this obligation. We can also then start aligning what are the risks. So if we look at the risks, we can assign the risks to that obligation. So now suddenly we don't just have a list of obligations, we have something that's a little bit more tangible, understanding that they're all interconnected and they are linked together. So for instance, we've got a risk that is connected to this obligation, which means claims processing must be classified as a critical operation for general insurance. So what we're going to look at is just the high-level claims value stream of lodging a claim or managing a claim through the life cycle. If we then go and click on that risk, it will give us the detail of that specific risk. It gives you the risk profile, what is captured against that risk, and it also starts demonstrating whether we've got controls against that risk. So now suddenly we're building out from obligations, what are our compliance needs, we have the risks associated, we've got some controls to say this is how we actually address those risks, and we can go into the detail where we go into the specific details of that risk. Again, we can start augmenting details against that risk. Here we can see that we've also got some KPIs that we need to meet, and again, sort of just looking at all the controls and the detail around that. If we go into the list view, we can then have a full set of what are all the risks that are associated within the organization and how do they relate back to the organization. So now we've started to see what about how we can insert all of the obligations or requirements, compliance requirements within the platform. We're starting to link risks to those obligations. We're starting to build controls against those regulations. And that's typically what organizations will do. They will create either big spreadsheets or different data sources to say, how do we get all of these artifacts linked together so that we can have obligations, risk controls, all linked together. But what about the process? How do we know where and how we execute, making sure that we deliver that process in the right way? So if we go back into the process module, and again, here's the process architectures that we can build on the left-hand side that pretty much represents that high-level view that Roger showed. But if we go into the specific claims management process, we can see that this is the level of the process. So I know it's a little bit small with all the swim lanes, but it clearly dictates in terms from when you lodge a claim all the way through to the life cycle, the different areas of the business. So again, talking about the functional structure versus how we execute are different because we've got lots of different handovers between different departments and how we follow that process. But if we zoom in into the process, and let's say we think about claim notification. Claim notification is how we lodge claims, but we've got certain obligations and risks and targets that we need to meet. And all of these icons at the bottom is what that is telling us. So clearly we can see that there's a risk associated with it. So now we know, right, there's a system outage. What is that risk? If we click on that risk, it will take you to that risk. We've got rules. Here's all the obligation requirements that we are actually required to meet to make sure that we are executing the way that we need to execute. We also got indicators. So we've got risk indicators. We've got performance indicators that we can go and capture against that process. So if we go to those metrics, we can actually go and see what the turnaround is and what the measurement for that specific detail of that specific process is. That one hasn't got anyone captured yet, but there are the other ones that capture. So really what I'm trying to show is all of the data points are now connected to each other. And it suddenly becomes a livable and a live environment where you can understand the relationship between your compliance needs and how you execute your strategy and whether you're in bounds or not. And you can also start understanding who's accountable, what are the trigger points. So let's say, for instance, there's a massive spike in a claims event after a massive weather event. How can we prove that we meet all of the requirements and tolerances that has been set by the regulator? So if we change that, so all of these parameters have been captured in the background, so all the metrics. So let's say, for instance, we want to see, right, what is the current status of the process with all of the metrics? Clearly, we can see, based on the requirements of what we need to meet, we can see that something is wrong when we outsource to our supplier network. And if we click on the measurement here, we can say, right, we've got a service level agreement against our suppliers that they need to act in a certain time frame and to make sure that we meet those obligatory requirements. And here you can clearly see where you can start capturing against those regulatory requirements and minimum timelines of what they should be, which is really that sort of target assess. What is happening with the process? Then we go into improvement of what is causing this? Do we not have enough capacity? So this is really where compliance and improvement come into one sort of synergy area where we can really start understanding how we can improve our processes and what we need to do to get from that lens. I know that this is a very fast way of showing how all of these objects come to life, but the key point that I'm trying to make is we take all of the objects that is relatable from a compliance, risk, controls, process base, and we can then align them from a data perspective, clearly showing who is responsible, when are they responsible. If we go back into this process, sorry, just go one level up. If we go into that process and we scroll down, we can clearly see who's responsible, what are all the different attributes, who's the roles, when was this last reviewed, and you can really get a full view of what is happening. Here's one of the areas where we've captured risk, KPIs, controls. So you get a full list of views. So it's not only just a view of a diagram, but it's really how the data is cross-referenced against all the objects in the platform. And realistically, at the end of the day, what you want to be able to see is to answer that question of how many compliance requirements do we have? What are the processes that's been impacted? Who's accountable for them? Are we meeting the tolerances set by the different regulatory standards? You should be able to then go and build a dashboard to say, right, here's all our obligations. Here's one that we need to review because it is due for review, or this one is in breach. Okay, so what do we need to do? Then we move into that continuous improvement. And that's when we start delivering value to the business. Suddenly, it's not just about we are documenting processes and creating diagrams. Now we're augmenting them with real value that prove value to the business. You can see all of your obligations, your risks, your controls, what are your key performance indicators. You can have your critical operations register, knowing what are the critical functions. Are they functioning the way that they should be functioning? You've got your risk register controls and so on. So it really is around having the data at your disposal. And that's where the value is really understanding how all of these data components relate to each other so that you can get informed data feedback from your processes and then start managing them the way that the business is required to manage. And anything that is out of tolerance, that's where you then would like to go and start conducting your assessments and follow your continuous improvement process lens from that perspective. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a snippet of how the tool really takes all of that information to help senior executives like Pieter at the university. So when that question comes through, how do we address knowing that you've got all of those obligations or requirements met? Well, it's when we start overlaying governance, risk, and compliance with process, where process doesn't live in a centralized island on its own, but it's really embedded and it's cross-functional against all of the different departments throughout the organization. One thing that I forgot to mention as well is we can go back to that process. So let's say, for instance, we need to go and prove the regulator says, please give us a document to show us how you actually control and manage this process. We can go and create specific templated books that then grabs all of that information and creates a white labeled branded template to your organization in one go. So it doesn't require people to go and collate different information, conform to tables, and then start writing a document. You can simply select that template and that will then prepare the document. There you go. It will generate that it's already been generated. But here's an example. So you've got your branded templated book, and it will give you all of the information that is required in terms of the obligations, the owners, the responsibility, when was the document and the process last audited, what were the changes. So it really becomes a live document showing the really all of the details with the process embedded. Just scrolling down to, so here you go. You can have all of the detail from who's owning it, whose responsibility. So you can create a really comprehensive document, knowing what rules, what KPIs you use, etc. So again, I know this was really a very, very quick way of demonstrating, but hopefully that gives you some idea of the capability of the tool and how it is used to help board members and executives and organizations to answer those questions and to get a plan in place to really get from that process maturity level where it really uses all of the enablers and also then starts helping proven business value for those improvement cycles, because it's not just about speed, it's also making sure that we can answer the question from a compliance perspective. Hope that was useful. Again, if there is any additional information or more questions, queries, or you want to book a session at a later stage, please feel free to reach out, because there's so much more to show in the platform. This was a very, very high-paced demonstration, but I hope you get the idea. Thank you very much.